Welcome to Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 1 through 5 in Seminar 4. Seminar 4 is entitled The Object Relation. However, it will already be clear in working through the first section of this seminar entitled Theorizing the Lack of Object that what we'll be addressing is something quite different than how the object is typically conceived within psychoanalysis. In this video, we'll spend some time describing object relations theory, what the lacking object is, the three kinds of lack and their developmental unfolding, and finally touch upon the phobia and fetish as two notable objects that will feature centrally in this seminar. One major way object relation theorists conceive of their difference from Freud is in placing more emphasis on the interpersonal, relational dynamics over biological drives. Early childhood experience leads to the internalization of an image of one's primary caregivers. This internalized image that comes to represent another person is what is called an object. Important to note is that what is initially internalized is generally not an image of the whole person, but only part of them, giving rise to the idea of a part object. And multiple part objects can be internalized of the same individual, leading sometimes to a split representation of the other, one all good and the other all bad. If psychological development goes according to plan, at some point these part objects are integrated such that we become capable of relating to others as whole integrated objects containing a mixture of the good and bad. When development doesn't go according to plan, these object relations are shaped by various defenses that seek to keep certain objects apart, elevating some, denigrating others, dominating some, being dominated by others, etc. And once a pattern of object relations is established in early childhood, one tends to seek out and/or treat new individuals in a manner that allows these object relations to continue playing themselves out. Now, I've greatly simplified the theory, and there are numerous differences among the theorists associated with this approach. But this will hopefully be a serviceable intro to this orientation to the object. It helps to keep in mind that this object is not what is typically meant in other philosophical discourses, wherein the object is something like the actual physical object in the real world, as opposed to the subject who studies and uses them. It's much closer to what we might consider a mental object, a kind of mental representation. Yet for object relations theory, this object is still intimately bound to the subject. It's a kind of mental object that fundamentally shapes subjectivity. So there is no sense of an independent or philosophical subject found here, at least not an obvious one. Lacan expresses several difficulties with this approach. First, he disputes the biologistic interpretation these object relation theorists impose upon Freud. Second, he disputes the overall conception of the object, whether it concerns some harmonic notion of it in infancy or the heavy emphasis on the lived experience of frustration that comes with the deprivation or saturation of the object. In fact, Lacan claims that what's of most importance is not the object relation itself, but the lack of an object, and how that lack is thought according to the three registers of the imaginary, real, and symbolic. Lacan disputes the biological interpretation of Freud using the hydroelectric power station as a metaphor for the emergence of psychic life. I'm not going to try to justify or dispute whether Lacan's interpretation is more faithful to Freud's text, as that issue doesn't really hold much interest for me, as does the implications of the metaphor for understanding Lacan's own thinking. The point of the hydroelectric power station metaphor is to show how even what is considered closest to natural biology remains fundamentally structured by the symbolic. This is not to deny that biology plays a role in psychic life. Instead, it's only to say that anything about its activity and impact is always already filtered through a symbolic structuring. The way Lacan puts it, the energy of the station only becomes of interest once it accumulates through the machine. Of course, there had to be prior conditions already established in the natural terrain for it to make sense to build a station there. But our access to this before is always already filtered through the symbolic presence of the station. The energy of the natural currents of the river thus always present themselves as something signifying, usable, and measurable. So it's like saying that we always come to nature with the power station always already having been there. Lacan uses the metaphor of energy to refer to the libido, which has often received a naturalistic interpretation. He identifies the id as the uncomprehended signifier that's always already installed and structured in the real. It's the machine that's storing up and using the libidinal energy. This adds a dimension to what's been previously stated regarding the id as an unconscious subject. Here, Lacan nuances the equation a bit by stating that the id is what becomes the I. It is the conception of the natural after it has already passed through the mediating influence of the symbolic. Finally, the station itself is constructed by what Lacan calls the intervention of the Holy Spirit. This Holy Spirit is the coming into existence of the signifier, the symbolic layering that is imposed upon the real. Why does Lacan call it the Holy Spirit? Well, if you're familiar with Zizek's writings, you may know he does quite a bit more with this notion. For Zizek and Lacan, there's no traditional belief in a God implied here. Instead, it's a way of communicating the creative function of the symbolic. In the manner that God's breath creates life, so the symbolic reshapes reality into a new creation, one that is retroactively made to be the very beginning of all. And for this reason, nature and biology is for Lacan something that already finds signifiers located in it. Another way Lacan seeks to distance himself from the object relations approach is that for him, the fundamental object is first and foremost a lacking object, a lost object that one seeks to rediscover. Lack is the central object relation, and as such, every finding of the object amounts to a kind of rediscovery. This lost object is bound to early infantile satisfactions that will subsequently motivate a search to rediscover the object through a kind of impossible repetition. And it is the gap between what is searched for and what is found that is of analytic interest. And there's a tension and conflict between the refound object and the object that's sought out. A tension captured in the tension between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. In Lacan's interpretation of Freud, the reality principle is a kind of delayed action pleasure principle. However, reality here should be placed in quotes since we're dealing with a profoundly unrealistic formulation, constructed in a hallucinatory manner. One seeks satisfaction in an imaginary object out of this hallucinated reality. And the object produced through the reality principle is an object that functions as a mask that fends off a primordial anxiety operating in the background of the subject's world. Lacan then situates the lacking object within the registers of the imaginary, real, and symbolic. Each register entails a specific way the object is missing, the level of the object missing, and the agent responsible for it being missing. We're only getting an initial glimpse of it in these first 5 lectures, so this will be an incomplete description of these modes of lack. First, frustration entails an imaginary detriment. It is the domain of unbridled and lawless demands. It concerns the lack of a real primordial object, and the agent responsible for this lack is considered to be the symbolic mother. Lacan notes that frustration has been given too prominent a role by object relation theorists, despite being only a marginal notion in Freud. Second, privation entails a real lack or hole. What is lacking here is the symbolic object. It is symbolic because the object has been defined by a law as having to already be there. He provides the example of a book that goes missing at a library. The book could very well be nearby, maybe the shelf over, the one that you're looking at, but due to the symbolic structuring here, the Dewey Decimal System, for example, the book is unable to be located. And so it's a symbolic object because it's only missing because of the symbolic structuring. And yet, the privation is real because the subject is truly deprived of the book. Third, Castration entails a kind of symbolic indebtedness. What is lacking here is the imaginary object, the phallus. How the subject comes to terms with castration will be of great importance for our understanding of phobias and fetishes. Now, to understand the three modes of lack being discussed here by Lacan, it's helpful to situate all this within a developmental unfolding. Again, all this is going to be preliminary consideration, which will deepen and perhaps correct as we continue to move through Seminar 4. So at the beginning, the child's relationship is with a real object, an object that affects the subject even before an idea of it can be formed. The real primordial object is commonly identified as the breast, though perhaps it could be the bottle just as readily. The point is that it's the primary source of sustenance that allows the infant to live. The primary caregiver here is most often identified as the symbolic mother. The first point of lack comes in the frustration of being deprived of the real object due to the absence of the symbolic mother, which we can think of as those failures in satisfying the demands of the child. The mother may be literally absent or may just be absent in not listening or responding to the child's demands. Consequently, the real object converts into a present absent object. That is a symbolic object which comes to be given or not by the mother, who converts into the real mother, an all-powerful kind of being. An example of such a present absent object is love. However, this symbolic object of love can be taken away, and this leads to a real privation and the realization that for the child to obtain this love, they will have to become the phallus themselves. That is, to become the object that pleases the primary caregiver and thereby ensuring that love is given. And so there's now another shift in emphasis from the symbolic object to the imaginary object of the phallus. Again, that is the source of enjoyment for the other, which the child then seeks to identify with. However, a crisis now occurs when the child realizes that they can never fully identify with the imaginary object upon the entrance of the paternal function of the symbolic father, wherein the child recognizes that they are not the mother's sole object of desire. Yet the child's recognition that they are unable to identify as the phallus also entails their recognizing that the mother also lacks the phallus, and so is also a subject of desire as well, is also a lacking subject. The acceptance of this double realization leads to the emergence of the third lack, symbolic castration, wherein it is the paternal function that both prohibits the child's identification with the phallus, but also introduces a symbolic relationship that allows for the possibility of moving beyond this phallus to instead substitute it for other more acceptable imaginary objects, ones that are structured by and contained within a symbolic law. However, there are many ways the subject addresses the anxiety of castration, and how it is dealt with will be critical for understanding the formation of the phobic and fetishistic object. Illustrating the phobic object is the case study of a young girl who develops a fear of an imagined dog who wants to bite her genitals. What Lacan notes here is that this is not merely some compensation for realizing her own lack of a phallus. She recently discovered boys have a penis. But more importantly, it follows after the mother returns from the hospital for an operation and she ends up looking very ill and frail and in need of help. At that point, the mother is no longer the symbolic mother, but the real mother, and as the real mother, becomes someone who is also lacking. So stated otherwise, first there is imaginary disappointment in discovering the phallus that one doesn't have. Second, there is the perception that the mother also lacks the phallus. Third, there is an attempt to repair or preserve the relationship with the mother. And it's at that point where the phobia breaks out in the form of a phantasmatic dog who enters as the one responsible for the whole situation of the lacking phallus. It's a sort of imaginary reconstruction of the situation that satisfies the pressing anxiety of the realizations going on. So it's owing to the imaginary dog as the phobic object that the whole situation becomes in any way thinkable and symbolically livable, at least provisionally. And it's for this reason that children are especially prone to developing phobias. Now, this is not a pathological process, but a natural part of the transition into symbolic castration. So, what about the case of the fetish object? Both the fetish and phobia entail a difficulty when there's the addition of the paternal function as a fourth component that's reconfiguring the imaginary pre-Oedipal triangle of child, mother, and phallus. The fetish object provides a symbolic substitute for the mother's missing phallus, whereas the phobic object furnishes an imaginary substitute for symbolic castration. So in the phobia, the castrating agent is in some sense displaced onto the dog, and with the fetish, there's some sense in which the attempt to preserve the presence of the phallus is enacted. It's a refusal to accept the lack of the object. The fetish then becomes the imaginary access to the lacking object. It gives an illusion of presence to that object. It's being an inanimate object, such as a shoe, makes it all the more perfectly satisfying since it's not going to go anywhere and it's not going to disappoint the subject. To love a slipper is to have the object of one's desire within reach, an object that's bereft of all subjectivity, and thus bereft of a lacking subject. Nonetheless, it's an unstable identification. Sometimes the subject identifies with the fetishistic object, other times with the mother. Not much more is said about this here other than it makes me wonder if the unstable identifications accounts for the two ways fetishes manifest, either actively or passively. So we'll see how that unfolds over time. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this channel by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. And as always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.